Chapter 1. A World Lost to Time. In a time so long ago that it almost slips through the fingers of memory, the Eastern Mediterranean was once alive with the pulse of powerful kingdoms and bustling ports. Palaces of gleaming stone rose from the earth like promises. Ships crossed blue waters bearing goods, gold, and secrets. Walls held back time, and kings believed their cities would last forever. But forever never comes in the shape we expect. One by one, the lights of the Bronze Age went out. First in whispers, then in flame. Troy fell. Not in the way of quiet decay, but in fire and fury. 1,000 ships, they said, were launched for the face of one woman, but when the walls of Troy crumbled, it was more than a city that died. With its fall came the unraveling of an entire age. Mycenae, once proud and wealthy, faded into ruins. Hattusa, heart of the Hittites, fell silent beneath the dust. Even mighty Egypt, though it did not fall, felt the tremble of the earth as the world it knew buckled. The people did not understand what was happening. Crops failed. Trade routes vanished like smoke. Whole towns emptied as if the wind had swept them away. Writing, once etched into clay and stone, grew rare. In this darkening age, knowledge did not spread, it retreated. Where kings had once issued orders, now there were only rumors. Where scribes had once kept careful records, now stories had. To live in the mouths of men. War had changed everything, but not in the way the warriors imagined. The Trojan War was meant to be a moment of glory, a clash of heroes, a tale of honor. Yet its aftermath left broken homes, grieving mothers, and wandering hearts. It left men who had seen too much and found too little. The bronze swords were rusting, the palaces were ash, and from those ashes a silence spread, deep and wide. Civilizations crumbled not just from sword or fire, but from forgetting. And as each generation passed, the truth of what once was became harder to hold on to. Names blurred. Dates vanished. Battles, once real and raw, became myth. Troy might have stood on real soil, but now it floated in stories. The world had changed, not by choice, but by collapse. And the memory of it all began to flicker like the final flame in a dying lamp. Songs in the dark, even in darkness, something stirs. Even as walls fall and scrolls burn, the human heart finds a way to carry forward. The fall of the Bronze Age did not silence everything. In the quiet corners of this changing world, new voices rose, not with swords, but with songs. They were not royal. They wore no crowns. These were the poets, the tellers of tales. They sat by firesides or walked from village to village, carrying nothing but their words. In the deep hours of night, when fear made sleep hard, they gave people something else to hold on to. They sang, but these were not songs of pride or victory. They did not boast of the cities that had burned or the treasures lost beneath stone. These were songs of men who could not find their way home. Songs of women who waited, watching the sea for sails that never returned. Songs of gods who were not always just, and of choices that weighed heavier than shields. In these songs, the world did not end, it wandered. The poets told of Odysseus, a man clever beyond measure, who sailed the wine-dark sea in search of Ithaca, his wife, his child, his place. They told of storms and sirens, of monsters and loss. They told of longing that stretched across years and oceans. It was not history, not in the way a scroll might hold dates or names, but it was true, truer in some ways than fact. It carried the feeling of a time when nothing was certain, except the need to keep moving forward. These tales were stitched together from pieces. A bit of this city's sorrow, a thread from that mother's cry, a whisper of a god who once walked the earth. And in each telling, the song changed slightly. One poet would add a storm, another would soften a hero's flaws. But the heart of the story stayed the same, a journey, a home. And all the wildness in between. In these darkened times, memory did not live in books. It lived in the breath of a voice and the rhythm of a verse. Each song was a torch passed from mouth to mouth, keeping alive the flicker of what once was and what still might be. Homer's vision centuries passed. The chaos of the collapse gave way to new beginnings, but the old stories did not disappear. Instead, they deepened. They settled into the bones of the people, like roots winding through forgotten ruins. And then, one day, a voice rose above them all. We call him Homer. We do not know his face, his exact birthplace, or even if he was one man or many. But we know his vision, because it shaped the very soul of the West. Blind, they said, yet able to see farther than most ever could. In his mind, the shattered tales of a fallen age became a single path. In his hands, the scattered songs became a mighty epic. The Odyssey was not just a story. It was a bridge between worlds. Homer took the fading memories of heroes and gave them new breath. He gave Odysseus a shape, a man not perfect, but persistent. A man who longed, who fought, who failed, who rose. A man who could see through tricks, but not always his own flaws. And in this tale, Homer gave shape to the sea itself, not just as water, but as mystery. The islands were more than land. They were tests. The winds more than weather. They were will. Every monster was a part of human fear. Every god, a mirror of our hopes and limits. Homer did not write with ink. His words lived in sound, passed down by memory and voice. And yet they held together across centuries. His story, born in a time without certainty, became the anchor for generations to come. Through his vision, the past did not vanish. It became a place we could visit again and again, in the heart's quiet hours, between two worlds. And so we stand, even now, between two fading lights. One, the glow of a world that once was golden, broken, yet still alive in memory. The other, the dawn of a world becoming shaped not by heroes, but by choices. The Odyssey lives in this in-between space. It is not merely a tale of old gods and lost kings. It is a whisper from a time when men still believed the heavens touched the earth, yet began to doubt. When the wind might still carry a god's voice, but the decision to sail or stay, that was a man's alone. Odysseus, wandering home, is not only a hero, he is each of us in our own way. He stands at the edge of two ages, one ruled by myth, one grounded in mortality. He speaks with immortals, but dreams only of human things: a bed, a wife, a fire, a name remembered. The sea he sails is the sea between certainty and search. The gods help and hinder, but they do not decide for him. His journey is not to conquer, but to return. And in that return, we find ourselves reflected, caught between what we once were and what we might still become. This is the heart of the Odyssey. A world lost to time, yes, but not to the soul. It invites us to sit quietly by its shore, to Listen not for thunder, but for the soft footfalls of memory. To feel the pull of stories shaped by loss and love. To remember that even when empires fall, even when the names fade, the journey, the longing remains. And so, gently, we step into the tale, not to rush it, not to master it, but to walk its winding path, one slow breath at a time. Chapter 2. The Call of the Sea. The halls of Ithaca had not heard their king's voice in 20 years. Time passed slowly here, like the tides that lapped endlessly at the island's edge. In the great hall of the palace, once filled with laughter, war stories, and the scent of roasted lamb, there now lingered something still and sad. Telemachus, son of Odysseus, sat quietly beneath the high rafters, surrounded by noise yet wrapped in silence. The suitors filled the hall like weeds in a neglected garden. Loud, wasteful, hungry, they drank wine that was not theirs, broke bread baked by servants they did not pay, and mocked the absence of the man whose seat remained empty, that chair. At the center of the room, Odysseus' chair. No one dared to sit in it, yet all eyes drifted toward it. Even the suitors, in their pride, knew something sacred lingered there. Telemachus would glance at it, and in that glance lived 1,000 unspoken things: anger, confusion, longing. He had no memories of his father's voice, no stories told directly from the man's lips. Only echoes passed down from others. Tales of a clever king, of Troy's long siege, of trickery and valor. He had grown up in the long shadow of someone he had never met. The boy, no, the young man now, sat apart from the revelry. His mother, Penelope, moved like a ghost through the halls, never truly resting, always weaving and unweaving, waiting for a man who had become myth. In his heart, Telemachus carried two fears. One, that his father was dead. The other, that he was alive and had simply not come home. Every day, those fears weighed heavier. The island had grown used to his absence, but Telemachus could not. The longer he stayed still, the more the world pressed down on him. Outside, the sky was often kind. Ithaca was green and rocky, kissed by the sun and bordered by a sea that whispered secrets. But in that hall, something rotted. The suitors were not just unwelcome, they were a sign of decay. Honor was thinning. The air was thick with entitlement. Telemachus watched, feeling smaller by the day. Yet something stirred in him. He didn't know what to call it yet, but it was like the early tide, a pull towards something far, something unknown. A stranger's spark, then she came. Not in a flash of lightning, but in the calmness of a stranger's step. She looked like a traveler, old, wise, wrapped in a cloak the color of ocean mist. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, had come to Ithaca, cloaked in mortal form. Telemachus did not know who she truly was, but something about her drew his attention. Her words did not command, yet they pierced the fog that had settled in his mind for years. They spoke under the olive trees. She asked questions no one else dared to ask. What do you believe happened to your father? Why do you let these men eat your food? What do you see when you look in the mirror? Your mother's sorrow or your father's strength? The questions were not cruel, but they did not let him hide. And in answering them, something in him shifted. He found his voice, not loud, not certain, but real. Athena did not push him into battle. She lit a fire that had long needed kindling. You are not a boy anymore, she said, her eyes steady. If your father is gone, you must learn it. If he lives, you must find him. The world does not give answers to those who do not ask questions. Her visit lasted only a short while, but the weight of her presence lingered long after she left. For the first time, Telemachus felt the urge not just to wait, but to move. Not because someone told him to, but because his spirit reached outward. He began to see that the world was not only what was inside those stone walls. There were ships. There were stories. There were winds waiting to carry someone willing to rise. And just like that, a boy who had sat in shadows now stood under the open sky. The gods did not hand him courage. They offered him a mirror, and in it he began to see the outline of a man who might someday be a king. The first assembly word spread quickly. The prince had called an assembly. It was the first gathering of the people in many years. The old men came, leaning on staffs. Fishermen paused their nets. Women watched from the edges. Even the suitors showed up, curious and smirking. The sun cast long rays across the stone floor as Telemachus stepped forward. His heart beat loudly in his chest. But he did not turn away. He stood where his father once had. The crowd was not kind nor cruel, simply waiting. The suitors rolled their eyes, some whispered. But the boy did not falter. His voice was unsure at first, the way new sails flap before they catch the wind. Yet as he spoke, he grew steadier. "You have filled my father's house with your noise," he said. "You eat our food, you press my mother, and yet not one of you lifts a hand to search for the man you claim to replace." There was silence. The air felt like it had shifted. Telemachus was not a warrior. He held no spear, but his words struck true. For so long, no one had named the wrongness aloud. Now, a young voice had done it, not as a child crying for justice, but as a man standing in it. Some men nodded. Others frowned. One suitor rose and sneered, calling him foolish, calling Odysseus a ghost. But Telemachus did not flinch. He had spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had taken a step, one not backward into fear, but forward into the unknown. This assembly did not change the world. The suitors stayed. But a door had opened. Something sacred had returned to the island. Not Odysseus, not yet, but something of him, his spirit, his defiance, his refusal to bow. And now that spark lived in his son. Setting sail that night, the stars hung low and clear over the bay. The winds whispered softly across the sand as if encouraging him onward. Telemachus did not sleep. He moved quietly, gathering supplies, whispering farewells to trusted hands. With Athena's guidance, a ship had been prepared, not a grand vessel, but one strong enough to face the waves. He did not tell the suitors. He did not make speeches. He simply moved through the shadows like a thought that had finally become a decision. The ship waited, her sail folded, her oars resting. The sea, dark and vast, was not gentle. But it called to him, not just as a path to his father, but as the only road left to becoming who he was meant to be. He stepped aboard. The wood creaked under his weight. The men he had chosen, few but loyal, looked to him. And for the first time, he did not look away. The ropes were loosened. The sail lifted. And Ithaca, with all its ghosts, began to shrink behind them. He did not know what he would find. Perhaps word of Odysseus in Sparta or Pylos. Perhaps nothing but silence. But this journey was more than a search for another man. It was a search for himself, for courage, for answers. For truth doth the waves met them, the stars watched. And somewhere across the horizon, destiny waited, not like a storm, but like a song that had waited too long to be sung. And Telemachus, son of the lost king, had begun to sing it. Chapter 3. Ithaca besieged. In the high chamber of Ithaca's palace, a single lamp burned through the stillness of the night. Shadows stretched across the walls like fingers, reaching for something long lost. Penelope, queen of the island and wife of the long-absent Odysseus, sat hunched over a loom. Her hands moved with quiet grace, weaving a burial shroud strand by strand. To the suitors, it was a noble task, a sign of a wife honoring her aging father-in-law, Laertes. But beneath this act lived a secret. What she wove by day, she unraveled each night. For years, this quiet rhythm had kept the suitors at bay. When the shroud is finished, she would say softly, I will choose one of you to marry. But the shroud never neared its end. Thread by thread, she resisted. In a world that had taken her husband and now pressed upon her home, this loom became her shield, her sword, her sanctuary. It was not courage that shouted. It was courage that endured in silence. Outside her chamber, the world shifted. Time moved forward, dragging with it the weight of absence. Odysseus had been gone for 20 years, 10 to the war at Troy, 10 more swallowed by the unknown. No news, no proof of death, no signs of life. Only the sea, that vast, cruel mystery, and the ache of waiting. Penelope bore it with a grace that the world mistook for stillness, but within her, storms brewed. She did not weep where others could see. She did not curse the gods aloud. But every thread she wove carried the weight of longing. Every night she unwove that thread with quiet fury. The suitors could not see it, but she was fighting, not with blades or banners, but with patience, with faith, with the belief that somewhere Odysseus lived and that she, in her waiting, kept something of him alive to the palace invasion. If grief had a smell, it might be wine spilled across stone floors, or the scent of roasted meat served without thanks. The palace, once a place of story, song, and rule, now echoed with laughter not born of joy but mockery. The suitors had not been invited. They simply came, one by one, like ants to honey. And once inside, they never left. There were dozens of them, noblemen from across the isles, sons of landowners, men with gold in their rings and emptiness in their hearts. They lounged in the great hall as though it were theirs. They played games, told tales, and passed judgment on a king they had never met. The servants moved quietly around them, eyes downcast, hands busy. The suitors noticed only what they could take: food, wine, pride. They did not threaten with swords. Their invasion was softer, slower, a cup drained here, a door left open there. They whispered about Penelope even in her presence, what she owed them, what she should accept. They smiled as they spoke, their voices soaked in entitlement. At first, the people of Ithaca said little. The suitors were many, and their families held power, and hadn't it been 20 years? Wasn't it natural for a throne to want a new king? But those who loved the old days saw the change, the slow decay. The palace's heartbeat, once steady, now faltered under the weight of greed. Penelope moved through it like a ghost refusing to vanish. She offered them hospitality because that was the law, but she offered nothing else. Her words were careful, her eyes sharper than they seemed. Each day she watched the palace grow darker, and still she wove dot, and upstairs the empty chair of Odysseus sat untouched. No one dared to claim it. Even the boldest suitor paused before it, eyes flickering. Some shadows, it seemed, could not be. Mocked, hospitality corrupted, there was a time in the days of gods and mortals when hospitality was sacred. A guest could not be harmed. A host could not be insulted. The gods watched such things closely, and a breach of this trust brought wrath. But now, in the halls of Ithaca, this bond had broken, not with a crash, but with a whisper. The suitors were guests in name only. They gave no gifts, offered no prayers. They used the kindness of the palace like a weapon, twisting it into something rotten. The wine they drank was not shared in friendship, but stolen in arrogance. The food they ate was not blessed, but devoured. They took, and laughed when no one stopped them. Even the sacred hearth, the heart of any Greek home, had grown cold. The fire burned, but not for warmth. It crackled under empty toasts and careless boasting. The gods, once honored with offerings, were mentioned only in jest. There were no songs sung to Athena, no libations poured to Zeus, only noise, only waste. Only men who believed themselves above tradition. Penelope saw it all. So did the servants, though they dared not speak it aloud. The palace no longer belonged to the family of Odysseus, it belonged to his absence. And in that vacuum, pride had rooted itself deeply. Every law of Xenia, the ancient code of guest and host, had been twisted. The suitors claimed the queen owed them a decision. That time had run out, but they never questioned their own conduct. They demanded her grace, but offered none in return. And still Penelope played her part. She smiled with restraint. She answered with patience. But inside, she kept account of each slight, of each wasteful feast, of each name spoken too freely. The gods might seem far now, but she had not forgotten them. Nor had she forgotten what becomes of men who mock the sacred. A mother's worry when word reached her that Telemachus had sailed. Something inside Penelope cracked, not loudly, not with wailing, but with a stillness that felt deeper than silence. Her son, her only son, had vanished into the sea without a word, chasing a shadow she had spent 2 decades surviving. She had always known this day would come. The sea calls to those born of it, and Telemachus had the blood of Odysseus. Restless, searching, bold. Still, she had hoped for more time, more mornings to see him walking the halls, more quiet talks beneath the olive trees, more moments when she could forget, if only for a breath, the fear of losing everything. Now both of them, husband and son, were somewhere beyond the horizon, and she was left to stand alone, a woman at the center of a crumbling world. The suitors noticed her quiet, but they mistook it for weakness. They whispered that now, at last, she must choose, that her line was broken, that Ithaca needed a new king, but they did not see the strength it took to remain still, to not collapse under the weight of fear, to not let the tears fall where others could see. Penelope mourned, yes, but she also waited. And in that waiting, she wove not just a shroud, but a prayer for her son's safe return, a prayer for her husband's survival, a prayer for justice, whispered into each thread. She stood at the top of the palace steps each evening, looking out toward the sea. The wind carried no word. The waves gave no answer. Yet she watched, she waited. She endured, for Penelope knew something the suitors did not. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet of a woman who refuses to be broken. Sometimes it is the patience to hold a kingdom together with thread, silence, and faith. And in that kind of strength, there is something divine. Chapter 4. The Boy Among Kings. The ship reached the shores of Pylos as morning light broke over the sea. The waves fell quiet against the sand, as if honoring the arrival of something sacred. Telemachus stepped ashore, eyes wide not just with wonder, but with the weight of all he had left behind. This was not Ithaca. This was the land of Nestor, one of the last great warriors of Troy, a man older than many of the tales still whispered around the hearth. Pylos did not boast with marble or gold. Its strength was in its people, its order, and the memory it carried. Nestor himself stood like a tree that had survived 1,000 seasons. His back bent only slightly, but his voice still carried across the courtyards. Time had not made him gentle. It had made him solid. The scars on his arms were not hidden. They told of battles fought, of comrades lost, and of choices made long ago. When he looked at Telemachus, he saw not just a visitor, but a son of someone he once bled beside. And as the two sat together beneath the shade of the colonnade, the past came alive, not in grand speeches, but in slow, quiet stories. Stories of Troy's burning towers, of trickery and storms, of Odysseus, clever, brave, often silent, always watching. Nestor spoke not like a bard, but like a man remembering the cost of glory. He told Telemachus that his father had been both trusted and feared because he thought deeper than most, acted faster than others, and bore the burden of consequence without complaint. The boy listened, the name Odysseus no longer just a shape in the dark, but a voice among men. In the eyes of Nestor, Telemachus saw not only memory, but measure, a glimpse of what it meant to stand tall among giants. And though he still felt small, something in him straightened. Hospitality remembered that evening. Pylos came alive in a way Ithaca had forgotten. Fires were lit. Food was prepared not in haste but with reverence. When Telemachus entered the hall, he was not questioned. He was honored. Nestor's sons moved about with purpose. Servants laid down water for the washing of feet, a gesture both sacred and simple. The seat he was offered was not just furniture. It was respect, freely given. In every gesture, in every word spoken with care. Telemachus felt the weight of tradition. This was how homes once welcomed strangers, with ritual, with open hands, with trust that the gods walked among men in disguise. In Pylos, these customs were not decoration, they were law. Not the kind written on stone, but the kind passed down through firelight and shared bread. And it was here, in the warmth of this hall, that Telemachus realized what Ithaca had lost. The suitors who filled his father's house had not just stolen food, they had broken something older and deeper. They had taken sacred laws and twisted them. Here, in Pylos, he saw what it was meant to be a guest, and what it meant to be a host. And in that quiet, he mourned for his home. Nestor asked questions gently, never pressing. He offered advice in the form of blessings. He gave Telemachus something more powerful than information. He gave him a mirror of what could be and what once was. In that mirror, the boy saw his future not as a shadow of his father, but as a continuation of honor. And as the night grew still, and the stars cast soft light across the earth, Telemachus felt something shift. He was not just a boy searching for a name. He was a name beginning to awaken. To Sparta, with questions the next morning, Telemachus set sail again, the sea stretching out before him like a road of whispers. Nestor, too old for travel, sent his own son to guide him, a quiet show of respect. The journey to Sparta was longer, the coastlines distant and carved by time. But the wind favored them, and the gods, though silent, did not resist. Sparta was different. The land stood firm, its people proud. There was strength in its stones and silence in its valleys. Telemachus entered the halls of Menelaus and Helen, names that had been carved into the fabric of war. They were not young now. Time had softened them, and in their eyes lived the weight of years no song could fully sing. Menelaus welcomed Telemachus with more than courtesy. He saw in the curve of the boy's face the echo of Odysseus. Helen too looked long, not with fear, but with memory. These were people who had survived not just war, but what came after. The long silence. The questions that never left. The burden of being remembered. They spoke in low tones over wine and quiet meals. Menelaus told of the wooden horse, of nights filled with fire and ash. He spoke of Odysseus leading with cleverness that had no equal. But his voice carried more than admiration. It carried regret for every hero lost, for every home delayed, for every moment when cunning could not protect the innocent. Helen, once called the face that launched 1,000 ships, did not speak like a legend. She spoke like a woman who had seen too much. She remembered Odysseus, the look in his eyes, the sharpness of his mind. He always saw things others missed, she said softly, her words like leaves falling, but wrapped in their truths were riddles. They spoke of signs, of sightings, of stories told by strangers who claimed to have seen Odysseus far off, trapped, struggling. Nothing was certain. Everything pointed outward. And in that uncertainty, Telemachus saw something familiar. His own questions, his own doubts. The people of Sparta had not forgotten. They carried his father's memory not as a burden, but as a thread stitched into their own lives. And so Telemachus listened not just to the stories, but to the silences between them. A living memory one night. As the moon climbed high and cast silver across the marble halls, Telemachus wandered the palace alone. He paused before a wall, lined with shields and spears, remnants of battles long ended. And there, he realized something simple and profound. His father was not just a story. He had walked these halls. He had spoken with these kings. He had bled in these lands. Every word spoken about Odysseus, every tale told by Nestor, Menelaus, Helen had not made him smaller, but more real. He was not just a clever mind or a distant name. He had laughed. He had wept. He had carried the weight of others and bore his own with grace. He had made enemies. He had made choices. And though he was far away, or perhaps gone, he still lived out in the hearts of those who knew him. Odysseus was not a ghost. He was a memory so vivid it shaped the way others stood, the way they spoke, the way they believed. That night, Telemachus sat beneath a tree in the palace garden and looked up. He did not pray aloud, but something inside him settled. Not an answer, but a grounding. He might never find his father, or he might. But now he understood. He was not chasing a shadow. He was walking a path that had already been carved by footsteps. And that path, though winding, was lit by the stories others had held safe. As the leaves moved gently above him, and the world exhaled in soft darkness, Telemachus closed his eyes. He was still young, still searching. But he was not lost. Not anymore. Chapter 5. The Island of Tears. Far from the lands of men, surrounded by an ocean without end, there lay an island so beautiful that even the gods paused to admire it. Its trees never withered, its fruit never spoiled. Sweet winds moved through, golden leaves, and the air smelled always of spring. Flowers bloomed beside streams of silver, and birds sang songs that needed no music to be lovely. It was a paradise untouched by time. But for one man, it was a cage made of soft hands and kind lies. Odysseus, once king of Ithaca and hero of Troy, now sat hunched on a rock by the water's edge. Day after day, he returned to the same place, the shore where the sea met the sky. He did not speak. He did not sing. He stared outward, eyes tracing the endless horizon as though willing it to bend, to break, to open a path home. Salt clung to his skin, not from the sea, but from his tears. He had survived wars and monsters. He had endured storms and betrayal. But here, on this perfect island, he was stuck. Not by chains, not by force, but by something harder to escape: sorrow. Calypso, the nymph who ruled this place, had offered him everything: comfort, shelter, immortality. But Odysseus did not want forever. He wanted home. Every tree he passed reminded him of Ithaca's olive groves. Every sunset brought back the memory of Penelope weaving by the hearth, Telemachus playing in the courtyard. Time moved. Differently here. It did not march forward. It circled, soft and silent, like a dream that would not end. But Odysseus was awake, and he felt each passing day like a stone pressed against his chest. There is pain in loss, but there is another kind of pain in longing, in knowing what you want and not being able to reach it. That was the pain Odysseus carried. He did not fight beasts now. He fought silence, and the memory of a world he could not touch. Calypso's love. Calypso was not cruel. She loved him. In her own way, perhaps, she loved him more deeply than anyone else ever had. She had seen him broken, shipwrecked, half dead upon her shore, and she had nursed him back to life. She had sung to him, offered him sweet fruits, and wrapped his wounds in cloths scented with herbs. In her eyes, he was not just a man. He was a gift fallen from the heavens. She offered him everything: her island, her beauty, her immortality. "Stay," she whispered each night. "Be mine. Live forever. You will never grow old. You will never suffer again." But Odysseus, though moved, could not accept. Her touch was warm, but it was not Penelope's. Her voice was soft, but it did not echo the halls of Ithaca. She did not smell like olive oil or hearth smoke. She did not carry the weight of his history, the ache of his journey, or the light of his home. He thanked her with his silence, not because he hated her, but because he could not lie. To accept her love would mean forgetting who he was. Forgetting the man who had once held his newborn son. Forgetting the woman who still waited by the loom. Forgetting the land that had shaped him. And so he sat by the shore. Not to hurt her, but to hold on to something she could not see. Memory. The thread that tied him to the world beyond this island. He did not want to live forever without it. For him, life without memory was not life at all. Calypso watched him. Day after day, sorrow blooming quietly in her immortal heart. She could not understand. She had offered the gift of eternity, but he had chosen longing instead, not out of pride, but out of love. And sometimes she would weep too, not for herself, but for the man who stared across the sea, waiting for a world that might never return him. The messenger god then, one day, the wind changed, the waves shifted, and from the sky came a shimmer of wings. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, touched down upon the island, his golden sandals skimming the grass. He was laughter and speed, light and word, a being made of movement. Calypso met him at the grove. She already knew why he had come. The gods had spoken. Zeus, father of the skies, had decided Odysseus must be released. The order came not with cruelty, but with clarity. Even the gods in their power could not deny the pull of a mortal's heart. Hermes, ever the swift one, delivered the message plainly. "It is not right," he said, "for one who longs for home to be held, no matter how fair the cage." The gods had watched Odysseus. They had seen his tears, his silence, his refusal to forget. They had seen the strength of a man who chose memory over magic. Calypso stood still, her eyes fixed on the waves. She had not trapped him with force. She had only hoped he would stay. But now she saw that hope fading. The gods had spoken. The sea would take him again. She returned to Odysseus, not with anger, but with softness. She told him he was free. Her voice did not tremble. Her smile was gentle. But her heart, hidden deep within, cracked like ice in spring. She would help him. Not because she wanted to, but because she loved him. And Odysseus bowed his head. Not in joy, not in victory, but in gratitude. Even now, after all this time, the gods had remembered him. And through the kindness of a heart he could not claim, the way home was opening. A raft of hope, together they built the raft. Not a great ship with sails of silk and oars of bronze. Just a simple vessel, shaped from trees and bound with rope. Calypso brought tools. Odysseus worked with quiet hands. He carved, he shaped, he tied. The sun rose and fell as wood met wood, and the raft began to take form. It was not built with haste. It was built with care, with the slow precision of a man who knew the sea and who knew what waited on the other side of it. Each beam placed was a prayer. Each knot tied was a promise, not just to reach home, but to remain himself along the way. Calypso watched from the trees, her face half hidden by vines. She did not interrupt. This was no longer her part to play. The raft was not hers, it was his. A raft made not of pine and twine, but of memory and longing. Of the ache for a wife not seen in 20 years. Of the hope that a son still waited. Of the belief that the gods had not abandoned him. When it was finished, Odysseus stood beside it in silence. The waves lapped gently. The breeze stirred. He looked back only once, at the island that had sheltered him, loved him, and now let him go. Calypso stood there, unmoving. No words were spoken. None were needed. He pushed the raft into the water. His feet touched the sea again, and it felt like returning to something older than time. He climbed aboard. The tide took hold, and slowly the island faded behind him. Ahead lay storms, unknown lands, gods and monsters, but also the threat of a home still waiting, of a chair left empty, of a name whispered in dreams. And as the raft floated into the vastness, Odysseus did not weep. Not now. His tears had already been shed. Now there was only wind, water, and the journey forward. Chapter 6. The Wrath of the Sea. The raft had barely cleared the reach of Calypso's island when the skies began to shift. What had been calm only hours ago now trembled with the weight of something ancient and unseen. The air thickened. The waves started to rise, not from chance but from memory. Somewhere far above the clouds, Poseidon, god of the sea, had turned his gaze downward. The man who had once driven a spear into the eye of his son now floated freely upon his domain. And the god had not forgotten. Poseidon did not rage like fire. He moved like a tide, slow at first, then sudden and overwhelming. The winds answered his call, rushing from every direction. They tore at the sky and lashed the sea into frenzy. The gentle blue turned dark and furious. The sun vanished behind. Clouds that rolled like mountains, and the sea grew teeth. Odysseus, alone on a fragile raft, saw the storm before it reached him. He did not cry out. There was no one to hear. He only braced himself as the first wave struck, high as a house and roaring with fury. The raft buckled. The ropes groaned. Water poured over the sides. The wind screamed that this was not a storm, born of weather. It was vengeance. Poseidon's wrath was not blind, it was aimed. The god did not seek to teach Odysseus a lesson. He sought to erase him, to scatter his bones among the waves. The sky cracked with thunder. Lightning split the clouds, and the sea became a battlefield with no shore in sight. Yet Odysseus held on, not to anger, not to hope, but to the simple, stubborn will to survive. The raft, built by his own hands, groaned under the weight of the ocean's rage. Still it floated, and still he fought to keep it upright. His muscles burned. His breath came in gasps, but he did not let go. For hours the sea tried to break him. Wave after wave crashed down. The raft tore apart, plank by plank. The wind shoved him under again and again. But Odysseus would not drown. Not yet, not here. Somewhere behind the storm, behind the roar of the waves, the memory of Ithaca still flickered. And it was enough to keep him afloat. The veil in the voice, when it seemed the sea would swallow him whole. When his fingers slipped from the last bit of wood, a new shape appeared in the chaos. From beneath the churning waves rose a figure, graceful, quiet, and glowing. It was Ino, once a mortal woman, now a sea goddess. She moved through the water like a whisper, untouched by storm or spray. Her voice, soft and clear, reached Odysseus. Not through his ears, but through something deeper, a part of him that still believed in help, in mercy. She did not offer rescue in the way he might have imagined. She did not lift him from the sea. Instead, she gave him something small, a veil, light and shining, blessed with protection. "Let go," her voice seemed to say. "The raft will fail. Trust the sea. Trust this gift." He hesitated, not out of doubt, but instinct. A raft, no matter how broken, felt safer than the open water. But he had no choice. Another wave struck, and the raft shattered fully beneath him. Pieces of it scattered like leaves. With nothing left to hold, Odysseus wrapped the veil around himself and surrendered to the water. It was not peace. It was not ease. The sea still raged. The waves still crashed. But now they did not kill. They pushed, they pulled, they tossed him like driftwood, but the veil kept him breathing, kept his limbs moving, kept his head above the worst of the storm. Ino vanished, her task done. She asked for no thanks. She left no trail. Sometimes help comes only at the edge of breaking, when all else has failed, and the will to live has nothing left to lean on but faith in the unseen. And Odysseus, stripped of all but breath, began to swim, not toward safety, but away from death. Stroke by stroke, he moved through a sea that did not want him. And yet, somehow, it could not keep him. One beam of wood time lost meaning. The sun rose and fell behind clouds that refused to part. Odysseus drifted, not as a hero, not as a king, but as a man reduced to motion. His body bruised by waves, his mouth filled with salt. Each breath hurt. Each kick felt heavier than the last. There was no raft, no sail, only a broken beam of wood, smooth and splintered, that floated beside him. He clung to it, not because it would save him, but because it gave his hands something to hold. Sometimes that is enough. The sea did not let up. It shifted its fury into new forms, currents that dragged him sideways, tides that spun him in place. But Odysseus, though barely conscious, refused to stop. He kicked, he paddled, he floated, he drifted. There was no glory here, no song to be sung, only survival, raw and quiet. And in that struggle, something powerful stirred. Not strength, exactly, but resolve. A kind of endurance that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with staying alive when there is no one to see it. He thought of Penelope, not in grand visions, but in brief flashes, her hand on his, her voice calling his name. He thought of Telemachus, now grown, walking in the palace he once ruled. These thoughts did not give him power. They gave him direction. The beam of wood became a companion, not a lifeline, but a link to the world that still waited. He had no weapons, no plan, but he had breath. He had will. And sometimes that is the root of all heroism. Not the victory, but the refusal to vanish. Washed ashore, and then, after days of fighting wind and water, the sea changed again. The sky began to open. The waves, still high, lost their fury. The winds fell to a whisper, and through the mist a dark line appeared, not a wave, not a cloud, but land. It was Phaeacia. A kingdom of soft beaches and gentle trees. A place far from Ithaca, but touched by the same sun. The sea, its wrath spent, carried Odysseus forward, not in triumph, but in silence. He reached the shallows crawling. The veil slipped from his chest, returning to the sea that had tried to kill him. His fingers dug into the sand. The water still tried to pull him back, but it had no strength left. And neither did he. He lay there for a time, face down, unmoving. Not dead, not safe. Just still. The waves lapped at his legs, not with hate now, but with indifference. The fight was over, for now. No crowd greeted him. No horns announced his arrival. There was no fire waiting, no throne. Just the wet sand beneath him and the quiet breath of survival. Odysseus had been stripped of everything, his ship, his weapons, even his pride. But he had not lost his name. He had not lost his journey. He had not lost the thread that connected him to home. And as the tide pulled gently away, leaving him alone on that foreign shore, the next chapter of his journey waited, just out of sight, just beyond the trees. Chapter 7. A Princess in the Trees. The storm had passed, but its weight lingered in Odysseus's body. His limbs ached. His skin stung with salt. His breath came slow and shallow. Yet he had survived. On the unfamiliar shores of Phaeacia, he lay nestled in a bed of reeds beneath the curve of a cliff. The sun now rose above the treetops, casting warm light across the soft sand. Birds sang in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of laurel and sea. He did not know this place, but for the first time in many days, the world around him did not seek to harm him. There were no gods striking from the sky, no waves trying to pull him under. Only the quiet sound of leaves moving, and the slow beating of his own heart. Then came laughter, light, playful and unburdened. A group of young women had arrived near the river's bend, not far from where Odysseus rested unseen. They carried linens and jugs, laughing as they set to their work. Among them was a girl who moved with natural grace, Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous. Her hair was braided with ribbons. Her steps were both royal and free as they finished washing garments. One of the handmaidens tossed a ball, and the girls began to play. Their voices echoed through the trees, and the ball, light as air, soared above them until one misthrow sent it tumbling into the river. A shout followed, and their laughter paused. It was then, in the stillness that followed, that Odysseus stirred from his hiding place. He rose slowly, unsure of how he must look, battered by the sea, clothed only in leaves and salt. He stepped out from the shadows, his form gaunt and marked by struggle. The handmaidens shrieked and scattered like birds startled from a tree. Only Nausicaa remained. She stood her ground, though her breath caught for a moment. What she saw was not a monster, not a wild man, but a figure that somehow carried dignity even in its ruin. His posture, his eyes, the way he did not rush. All of it hinted at something deeper than what the surface told. This was not how kings met. Not in palaces, not at feasts. But life often offers its most important meetings in places quiet and strange, by rivers, under trees, between games and silences. The language of grace Odysseus did not beg. He did not cry out. Instead, he lowered his gaze and spoke carefully, shaping each word with the care of someone who understood how easily fear can bloom. He honored her with his voice, compared her to a goddess not to flatter, but to express genuine awe. There was nothing in his words that reached, only gratitude, humility, and poise. Nausicaa listened. At first, she studied him like a puzzle, trying to understand how a man so worn could still speak with such beauty. Then, she softened. She saw beyond his sea-soaked skin and weathered face. She saw the shape of nobility, not in gold, but in character. With gentle words, she answered, "Him." She offered clothes, then water, then a path forward. Her maids returned at her nod, their fear replaced with quiet wonder. They brought him garments left on the rocks and turned their backs while he washed in the river. With each movement, Odysseus slowly shed the layers of ruin and sorrow. Clean again, dressed in tunics fit for a traveler, he stood tall, not restored, but rebalanced. There was no romance in this meeting, no fire, no promise, but there was kindness, there was trust. And sometimes that is more rare and more powerful. Nausicaa did not press him for his name. She did not ask what gods he had angered, what wars he had fought. She simply saw a man in need of help, and she offered it without pride. That was her strength. And in her quiet courage, Odysseus felt something he had not known for many years. Peace. The royal road. When the moment had passed, Nausicaa gave him instructions. "Follow behind," she said, "not too close. Walk the road into the city, past the groves and the stone paths. There my mother, the queen, will know what to do." She did not parade him. She did not announce him. Instead, she preserved his dignity. She gave him a way to return to the world on his own feet. As he walked the winding road into Phaeacia, Athena watched from above. The goddess, protector of Odysseus, cast a mist over him, not to hide, but to shield. A soft veil that kept curious eyes from looking too closely. The city was lively. Markets buzzed with tradesmen, and fountains poured clean water into smooth basins. But no one saw the wanderer walking quietly through their streets. Phaeacia was a land of peace, untouched by war. Its walls stood clean, its doors unbarred. The people here sang not of battles but of dances and ships. They were masters of the sea but not of conquest. Their wealth came from craftsmanship, from harmony with the waters they sailed. Odysseus walked this place with care. Every step forward felt unfamiliar, yet familiar, like walking through a dream that echoed of home. He saw olive trees shaped by loving hands, stone paths worn smooth by time. He passed temples, gardens, and walls covered in vines. Though no one saw him, he felt the hum of life around him, the quiet comfort of civilization. This road, short though it was, became a bridge between what he had survived and what he hoped to find again. A road not to his kingdom, but to a place that might help him find it. The queen of hospitality at the heart of Phaeacia's palace, Queen Arete, sat in calm majesty. Her throne was not grand in size, but rich in meaning. She ruled beside her husband, King Alcinous, but it was her wisdom the people trusted most. It was said she settled disputes with a single look. It was said no one walked away from her presence. Unchanged, Odysseus entered her hall with the humility of a man who knew how precious welcome could be. Still cloaked by Athena's mist, he approached the queen, then dropped to his knees and reached for her robe. As his fingers brushed the fabric, the mist lifted and the hall fell still. All eyes turned. But before a single voice could rise, Arete spoke. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Rise, stranger. You are welcome in this house." With those words, the world tilted back toward its balance. Odysseus stood, not as a beggar, not as a castaway, but as a guest. Servants moved quickly. Water was brought, a stool placed, food offered, and silence fell as all waited to hear. His story. He did not tell all, not yet, only that he had wandered far, that the gods had tossed him, that he sought only a ship to carry him onward. His voice was calm, his eyes steady, but every word carried the weight of oceans. Arete listened closely, her gaze deep. She saw the truth that was not spoken, that this man had suffered but had not broken. She asked no harsh questions. She offered no pity, only space, only care, only dignity. And as night fell upon the palace and the lamps were lit with golden oil, Odysseus sat at a table once again. The bread was soft. The wine was sweet. The fire crackled not with danger, but with peace. For the first time in many long years, he was not running. He was not hiding. He was not fighting. He was simply a man among people, a traveler resting, a heart still beating, and the world, at least for now, felt gentle again. Chapter 8. The Hall of Song. The palace of the Phaeacians stood like a sculpture of light. Its walls shimmered with polished stone. Water flowed through carved channels along the floor, and bronze doors glinted under the flicker of torches. It was a place that belonged not to war or to wilderness, but to peace. Within its halls, laughter rose gently, and the scent of roasted meats lingered beside the fragrance of crushed herbs. This was not a place of exile or survival. It was a space of welcome. Odysseus entered this hall not as a king, nor as a name, but as a stranger. He had no title to announce, no herald to speak for him. He sat quietly at the edge of the feast, observing. Around him, men and women in fine robes poured wine and passed platters from hand to hand. Their lives were untouched by hardship. There, laughter was light. No one asked who he was. No one pried. Instead, they gave him what mattered first, bread and rest. A seat near the fire, a drink in his hand. And in time, music. The Phaeacians did not fear strangers. They honored them. They treated them as the gods might in disguise. And so, Odysseus sat among them, nameless, tired, and watchful. But in the rhythm of the feast, something softened inside him. He did not have to run here. He did not have to explain. He could simply breathe. And when the lyre was brought forward and the singer took his place, Odysseus listened, not with his ears alone, but with the aching, listening stillness of a man who has walked too far and heard too much. The voice of Demodocus, the bard's name was Demodocus. He was blind, but not lost. Where others saw with their eyes, he saw with sound and memory. His fingers moved across the strings like water gliding over stone. When he began to sing, the room fell into silence, not out of command, but out of reverence. His voice was slow and steady, carrying the first notes of a tale that all had heard, but none could forget: the war at Troy, the ships, the walls, the heroes, the gods, and then the wooden horse, the trick, the fall, the fire. Odysseus sat still, but his breath caught in his throat. Demodocus's song was not just a story. It was a mirror. Every word opened a door he had long kept closed. He remembered the sounds, the clash of armor, the cries of fallen friends. He remembered the face of Hector, the fire in Achilles, the silence that followed the burning of the city. He remembered his own part, the plan, the courage, the costad, and as the room listened in joy, Odysseus wept. Not loudly, not openly, but with quiet tears that slipped down his weathered face. He turned his head so others would not see, but the grief could not be hidden. He did not weep because the bard had sung well. He wept because the song had pierced the shell he had built around himself. The music had reached the raw truth within him, the pain, the pride, the sorrow. It reminded him of who he had been and what he had lost. No one else noticed, but one pair of eyes did, the eyes of the king. Alcinous, wise and patient, saw the stranger's grief. He did not interrupt. He waited, because he understood that sometimes tears are not a weakness, but a sign that a man still holds on to what matters. The question, when the music faded and the hall returned to the clinking of cups and the murmur of voices, King Alcinous rose. He did not speak with force. His tone was gentle, the way one might speak to a friend in the dark. He turned to the stranger and asked the question that had waited too long. "Who are you?" Simple words, softly spoken. But they landed like stones in still water. The room grew quiet again. Even the servants paused in their steps. Odysseus looked up. His face was calm, but his heart stirred. For weeks he had been many things, a fairy than any things. Castaway, a sailor, a beggar in rags, but never himself. Not fully. He had been silent because he had to be. But now the silence broke. The question was not asked with suspicion. It came with kindness, and in that it had power. The kind of power that disarms a guarded heart. Odysseus took a breath. He looked around the hall at the faces that had offered him food, song, and shelter. At the queen who had welcomed him without fear. At the king who had watched without pressing. And at the bard whose music had opened the door. The mask he had worn slipped away. Not because it had been pulled, but because it was no longer needed. The time for hiding had passed. I am Odysseus, he stood, not proudly, not to make a show, but simply quietly as a man who had remembered his name. I am Odysseus, he said, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. And with those words, the story began. He did not boast. He did not rush. He spoke like a man walking barefoot across old ground, careful, slow, certain. He told them of Troy, of the war, the fire, the 10 long years, of the sorrow of victory and the hope that burned quietly for home. Then he told of the journey, of the islands, the monsters, the winds, the gods. He spoke of the lotus eaters who forgot everything, of Polyphemus, the cyclops whose eye he had taken, of Aeolus, keeper of winds, of Circe who turned men to beasts, of the dead and the underworld, of the sirens, the whirlpool, the storms. He told of his crew and how they had died, not all at once, but slowly, one by one. Each name still lived in his voice. Each memory, a weight he carried. He spoke of Calypso, who offered him forever, and of how he said no. Of the sea that broke him, of the beam of wood, of the veil that saved him, of Nausicaa, of Phaeacia. And when he finished, the hall remained still. No one cheered. No one clapped. They simply sat with him, not as strangers now, but as people who had listened and seen. For Odysseus, it was not just a story. It was a way back to himself. Every word he spoke helped him rebuild the man who had almost disappeared beneath waves and years. He had not come home yet. The journey was not over, but now he had remembered who he was. And in the remembering, the journey found meaning. In the hall of song, a story had been sung. And now, a story had been told. And in both, the world had quietly changed. Chapter 9. The War After the War. The war at Troy had ended. The fires were out, the gates broken, and the songs of victory already fading into silence. But for Odysseus and his men, the journey home had only just begun. With sails raised and hearts weary, they set out across the open sea, carrying memories of fire and fallen friends. At first, there was hope in the air. The winds were gentle. The waters shimmered with calm. The promise of Ithaca felt near. Yet even the earliest stop would remind them that peace is fragile and war leaves shadows. They came to the land of the Cicones, a coastal city called Ismarus. It was a place of bounty, with fields rich in grain and cattle roaming the hills. The warriors from Troy, still burning with the hunger of conquest, saw an easy target. They fell upon the town with the force of habit, not wisdom. Houses were sacked, treasures taken, and lives lost. The Chiconas were caught unaware. It felt like victory once more. The men rejoiced, drank, and loaded their ships with spoils. But Odysseus warned them. He urged retreat, swift departure before the day turned. They did not listen. As the sun rose higher, the Chiconas rallied. Their warriors came down from the hills, not broken villagers, but trained fighters, backed by horsemen and anger. A battle broke out on the very shores that had seemed peaceful just hours before. The Greeks, weighed down by greed and tired from celebration, could not hold. Spears found flesh. Shields cracked. Blood darkened the sand. 6 men from each ship fell, lives paid for in delay and disobedience. When they finally sailed away, it was not in triumph, but with heavy silence and fewer voices on deck. This was the first loss after Troy, and it would not be the last. The lesson was clear. The war may have ended, but the danger had not. Lotus eaters, the wind shifted again. The ships drifted through pale mists and quiet seas, where the horizon blurred like a dream. Days passed without the sight of land. The men grew restless. Then, like a mirage made real, an island appeared, lush, still, and strange. The crew landed, eager for food, for rest, for something softer than the harsh decks they called home. They were met not with swords, but smiles. A gentle people welcomed them, offering no harm, only peace. And with that peace, they offered the fruit of the lotus. It was small, golden, and sweet. A single bite brought not just pleasure, but forgetfulness. The ache of homesickness, the wounds of battle, the long days at sea, all of it drifted away. Like mist in morning light, some of the men ate and smiled. They lay down in the grass and forgot why they had come. They forgot where they were going. They no longer spoke of Ithaca, of family, of the sea. They were content. But contentment, Odysseus knew, was not the same as healing. It was not peace. It was surrender. When he saw the change, he acted. He pulled the men from the shore by force, dragging them back to the ships. They cried out, begged to stay, but he tied them to the benches with ropes. He ordered the sails raised, the oars struck. They left behind the island of the lotus eaters with sorrowful eyes and heads clouded with longing. Odysseus did not look back. He understood the danger of forgetting too soon, of giving up pain without understanding it. The sea offered no place for dreams that kept a man still. They had a journey to complete, and to finish it, they had to remember. The Cyclops cave, the wind drove them onward. Another island rose from the blue, its cliffs white as bone. It was quiet, untouched, and full of promise. Hungry and curious, Odysseus led a group inland. They followed a trail of sheep and goats up the slope until they came to a cave, vast and shadowy, its entrance flanked by stones the size of chariots. Inside they found food, cheese stacked in clay jars, milk still warm in bowls, meats hanging from the rafters. It was the home of a shepherd, they thought, though no shepherd they had ever known. They ate. They waited, and then he returned, a giant, a Cyclops. One eye stared from the center of his forehead, filled not with curiosity but hunger. His name was Polyphemus. He did not greet them with kindness. Instead, he rolled a stone across the cave. Mouth, a boulder none could move, and turned to them with slow, terrible purpose. One by one, he grabbed men in his hands like twigs. He crushed them. He ate them. Bones snapped. Screams echoed. The cave became a prison of blood and stone. Odysseus did not despair. He watched. He thought. He waited for night. With the help of his men, he sharpened a great wooden stake. They hid it in the embers. And when the Cyclops slept, snoring like thunder, they drove it into his eye. He howled, blind and wild, crashing into walls. The stone at the entrance still blocked escape. But in his pain, Polyphemus let his sheep go free, and the men clung to the bellies of the animals. One by one, they slipped out beneath the giant's hands. Unseen and unharmed, it was a victory, brutal and brilliant. They returned to the ships, shaken but alive. Yet in the air, something had shifted. The sea felt colder, the wind less kind. They had escaped a monster, yes, but they had awakened something greater. The name that should not have been spoken. As the ships pulled away from the shore, Polyphemus stood on the cliffs, bleeding and blind. He cried out, not just in pain, but in fury. Who has done this? He screamed into the winds. And from the deck of his ship, with pride swelling in his chest, Odysseus called back, "It was I, Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." The name flew across the waves like an arrow. The Cyclops, beaten but not broken, lifted his arms to the sky. He was not just a beast, he was the son of Poseidon, god of the sea. And with that name, he made his prayer. "Father," he cried, "hear me. Curse this man. Let him wander far and long. Let his home be out of reach. Let his men fall. Let sorrow follow him. Let the sea rise against him." The sea listened. Odysseus, clever as he was, had made a grave mistake. In claiming glory, he had invited wrath. From that moment on, the waves would no longer carry him with ease. Storms would find him. Monsters would wait for him. Islands would trap him. The journey, already long, would grow longer still. And each loss that came after, each storm, each death, each tear, could be traced back to that moment. A name spoken too loud in a moment too proud. And yet the ship sailed on. The men still rowed. The stars still shone overhead. The path home remained, though it would twist and turn and darken. The war was over, yes, but now began the trials of return. The war after the war. Chapter 10. Between Monsters and Memory. The sea had become a path of grief and wonder. After the storm, after the Cyclops, after the cries of the blinded giant faded into memory, Odysseus and his men reached the floating isle of Aeolia, home of the Keeper of Winds. The godlike Aeolus, moved by their trials and the spark of cleverness in Odysseus's eyes, offered a gift, a leather bag tied tight with silver cords. Inside it, he had bound all the wild winds of the world, north, south, east, and west, locking away every gust and gale, every storm that might threaten their path. All but one, the western wind, the breath that would carry them home. With hope stitched into the sail and Ithaca just beyond the horizon, Odysseus held the bag close. For 9 days and nights, they sailed smooth and steady. The scent of home began to drift on the breeze. Hills faintly shaped like those of Ithaca rose in the distance. The journey, so long and full of sorrow, seemed almost complete. But then, sleep. Exhausted by watchfulness, Odysseus closed his eyes, trusting the sea to remain calm and the men to remain faithful. But whispers stirred among the crew. They eyed the bag and spoke in hushed tones. They thought it gold, silver, treasure stolen for himself. Greed and suspicion, small seeds sown by hardship, bloomed into action. They untied the cords. In an instant, the sky tore open. The trapped winds burst free in a furious roar. The ships were thrown into chaos. The horizon shattered. The coastline of Ithaca, once so near, vanished into storm and spray. The men cried out, but no sound could rise above the howling. The ships turned, spun, were hurled back into the heart of the sea. When they reached Iolia again, defeated and soaked, Odysseus begged for help once more. But Aeolus, sensing divine anger behind their misfortune, refused. "You must be cursed," he said. And so they sailed away, the bag now empty, the chance now lost. The lesson echoed in every creaking timber. Even the best wind cannot carry you home if doubt weighs down the deck. The cannibals' harbor days passed. The sea calmed, but left them weary. They drifted from island to island, hoping for safe harbor, for food, for land where no monsters waited. Then came a new shore, cliffs tall and strange, waters still as glass. The place seemed peaceful. A harbor, shaped like a bowl, closed in by jagged stone arms. One ship, scouting ahead, went forward. The others followed soon after. They did not know they were sailing into the mouth of death. This was the land of the Laestrygonians, giants in human shape, but with hearts that beat not with warmth, but with hunger. The first crew to land was met not by greetings, but by blood. One sailor was seized and eaten on sight. The rest fled, screaming, trying to warn the others. But it was too late. From the cliffs above, spears flew like rain. Stones were hurled, smashing decks, cracking ribs. The narrow harbor became a trap. The ships could not turn. The giants stood above, laughing, destroying. 11 ships were shattered. 11 ships full of lives, swallowed in moments. Odysseus, always wary, had kept his own ship outside the harbor, tethered to open sea. He saw the horror unfold from a distance. Flames rose. Men cried. Wood splintered. The sea turned red. He cut the ropes and fled, his ship now the last. There was no battle to win, no trick to outsmart. Only escape. When dawn came, silence followed. The men who remained no longer spoke of Ithaca with joy, but with longing sharpened by fear. They had survived, yes, but the sea had begun its slow, cruel harvest. The war after the war had turned darker still. Circe's spell, they reached another island. This one seemed calm, almost too calm. Forests of green stretched toward a mountain. Wild creatures roamed unafraid. Smoke curled from a distant roof. The island was Aea, home to Circe, the sorceress whose power danced between beauty and danger. Odysseus sent a group ahead to explore. They found a grand house of polished stone tucked deep in the woods. Circe welcomed them. Her voice was soft, her hands graceful. She smiled, poured wine, offered food. But her kindness was laced with something unseen. As the men drank, laughed, and lowered their guard, she whispered spells under her breath. One by one, they changed. Faces twisted, limbs shortened, voices turned to grunts. The men had become pigs, not just in form, but in spirit, trapped. In the shape of beasts, Only one escaped. He ran back to the ship trembling, voice broken by fear. Odysseus prepared to go himself. But before he left, a messenger arrived, Hermes, the winged god, moving unseen. He offered a gift, a sprig of moly, a flower that would resist Circe's magic. Armed with it, Odysseus entered her halls. Circe tried her spell. It failed. He stood strong, sword drawn, eyes sharp. Surprised, she lowered her hands. "Who are you?" she asked. "Why does my charm not work on you?" Odysseus did not threaten. He did not rage. He spoke with calm and clarity. In this, she saw something different. Not just a man, but a soul marked by many storms. She offered peace. She restored the men to human form. They wept, falling into each other's arms. Circe, it seemed, was not cruel by nature, only alone. She invited them to stay, a year forgotten, and so they did. The days grew soft. The winds quieted. Circe's island became a place of rest. The men, once ragged and hollow-eyed, began to laugh again. They bathed in clear streams, ate fruit from golden trees, and slept in beds that did not rock with the sea. Time passed like a dream, not rushed, not marked. Just warmth and ease and silence. Circe smiled at Odysseus. She spoke with him, often, and her words were gentle. She knew many things, of herbs, of gods, of the stars. She told him stories, some sad, some strange. For a moment, he almost believed the journey could end here. That peace could be enough, but the heart remembers. And the compass, though buried under comfort, still points toward home. One morning, Odysseus stood at the edge of the forest. The sea glittered before him. His ship, repaired and waiting, rocked softly in the tide. He thought of Penelope, of Telemachus, of Ithaca, not just a place, but a promise. Circe joined him. She said nothing at first. Then softly, "You must go." He nodded. Circe, he gave him advice, whispered warnings. The road ahead would not grow easier, but she did not try to stop him. She knew, as all who truly love must know, that the deepest kindness is letting go. The men boarded the ship again. They left the island with full bellies and mixed hearts. Behind them, Circe stood on the shore, a figure framed in morning light. The sea opened once more. The horizon stretched wide. But the crew had changed. Odysseus had changed. They were no longer just survivors. They were wanderers between monsters and memory, men carrying stories, shaped by storms, still chasing the fading shape of home. Chapter 11. Voices Beneath the Earth. There comes a moment in every journey when forward is no longer a direction on the map, but a descent into the unknown. For Odysseus, that moment arrived when Circe whispered the next step. To reach home, he must first cross the threshold between the living and the dead. The answer he needed, how to break the curse of endless wandering, lay not in the stars above, but in the shadows below. He sailed west, far beyond the familiar, toward the edge of the known world. There, the sun did not rise and the sky held no color. The sea turned thick and heavy, like ink poured across the earth. No birds flew, no winds danced. The horizon faded and silence pressed on all sides. Even the bravest among the crew grew quiet, their eyes fixed on the water as if expecting it to whisper back. At last, they reached the shore that no light touched, a place beyond names, where the river Oceanus flowed around the rim of the world. Here, The gate to the underworld stood unseen, but waiting. Odysseus stepped ashore with trembling hands. He carried a black lamb and a sharp blade. As Circe had taught him, he dug a trench into the cold earth, poured out offerings of milk, honey, and wine, and then, with a steady arm, let the blood of the lamb soak the soil. It was this blood that called them the dead. Shadows of warriors and mothers, kings and beggars, all drifting up through the ground like smoke through cracks. They did not speak at first. They hovered, empty-eyed, mouths open as if trying to remember breath. Odysseus stood guard over the pit, sword drawn. He waited for the voice that could guide him. In the land of silence, one voice still held weight, a prophet who even death could not quiet. The prophet's warning from the gathering shades. One figure rose clearer than the rest, Tiresias, the blind seer of Thebes. In life he had spoken the riddles of the gods. In death he still saw more than most. His eyes were dark hollows, yet they gazed straight into Odysseus's soul. The hero stepped back, shaken not by fear, but by reverence. Tiresias drank from the trench. The blood gave him voice, and with it he began to speak. "You seek to return," he said, "but the sea will not carry you gently. The wrath of Poseidon waits, stirred by the name you spoke in pride. Your path home lies through pain. Yet there is hope if you remember restraint." He warned of an island, Thrinacia, where the sun god kept his sacred cattle. "Do not touch them," Tiresias said. "No matter how hungry you grow, no matter how long you drift, leave them untouched. If you harm them, ruin will follow." Odysseus listened. He took in every word, every sign. The prophet spoke not just of dangers, but of the long shape of what lay ahead, the trials, the temptations, the narrow chances. He told Odysseus that once he returned to Ithaca, his work would not be done. He would have to reclaim his place, restore what was broken, and in the end, make peace with the gods in lands still unknown. The warning was a map written in riddles, but it was all he had. The way forward was no longer a matter of wind or sail. It would be a test of will memory and sacrifice. The mother and the ghosts, Tiresias faded into the mist, but the trench still called to the dead. More figures gathered. Faces Odysseus knew and had tried to forget. Then came one that stopped his breath, his mother, Anticlea. In his mind, she had still lived. He had imagined her waiting by the hearth, praying for his safe return. But now, here she was, thin as moonlight, eyes wet with recognition. He had not known she had died. He reached out, but his hands met only air. She smiled faintly and told him the truth. The sorrow of waiting, the ache of his absence, had worn her down. Her words were soft, but they pierced deep. She asked of Ithaca, of his wife, his son. Odysseus answered through tears. In that place where no warmth lived, grief flowed free. Other ghosts followed, comrades from Troy. There was Elpenor, who had died on Circe's island, falling from a rooftop in drunken sleep. He begged Odysseus to return and bury his body, to give him the peace that had been denied. Odysseus promised he would. And then came warriors, Agamemnon, who spoke of betrayal and death at his own hearth. Ajax, proud and silent, still bitter over the armor of Achilles. Each soul carried sorrow. Each face reflected the weight of war and the thin line between glory and ruin. Here, Odysseus saw more clearly than ever before. The dead do not forget. They carry every wound, every word, every choice. and in their company the journey home felt both closer and heavier. Achilles' sadness among the many shadows one stood taller, quieter, still. Achilles, the greatest of Greek heroes. In life his name had burned bright, his rage shaping the course of battles. In death he was calm. Odysseus approached him with honor. He spoke of Troy, of the songs sung in Achilles' name, of the glory that had not faded. But Achilles did not smile. "Do not speak to me of glory," he said. "I would rather be a poor farmer alive than a king among the dead." His words were heavy. In the world of the living, his name meant power, immortality, and legend. But here, in the still fields of the underworld, it meant nothing. He missed the sun, the wind, the small joys, a child's laughter, the feel of warm earth under bare feet. Odysseus stood in silence. For all his travels, all his victories, here was the truth. Even the greatest warrior would trade eternity for a single day of life. Not all glories glow forever, and the songs of men are not always enough to quiet the silence of the grave. Achilles asked of his son, Neoptolemus, and Odysseus spoke of his courage, his strength in battle. It brought a brief light to Achilles' face, a flicker of pride. But it faded quickly. The shadows began to press close. The trench no longer fed them. The air grew colder. Odysseus, heart-burdened with all he had heard, turned back. The voices faded. The darkness fell deeper. The ship waited. The sea still stretched ahead. And so Odysseus left the land of the dead, not cleansed, but changed, not stronger, but wiser. He carried with him not just prophecy, but memory, the warnings of Tiresias, the sorrow of his mother, the grief of friends, the sadness of Achilles. The living must carry the dead forward, and Odysseus would. Chapter 12. Songs that Shatter. The sea was calm again, but the calm was different now. It was heavy, not light. The wind pushed slow and steady across the waves, and the ship cut through the water like a quiet thought. Odysseus sat still at the stern, his eyes deep with memory. He had spoken to the dead, seen their faces, heard their voices. He carried their warnings now, not like a burden, but like armor. The journey was not over, and ahead still waited tests. That flesh alone could not pass. Circe's last gift had been knowledge. She had warned him of the sirens, strange beings whose song could bend the mind, not with fear, but with beauty. They did not kill with claws or teeth. They sang, and those who heard them forgot everything else. Men would steer their ships toward the music, smiling as their hulls shattered on hidden rocks. But Odysseus would not turn back. He would not run from truth, even if it hurt to hear. So he made a plan. He took beeswax and pressed it into the ears of his crew. One by one, he made them deaf to the danger. But for himself, he chose another path. He had them bind him tightly to the mast with ropes. "No matter what I say," he told them, "no matter how I scream, do not untie me." And so they sailed on. The island of the Sirens came into view, small, sharp, and strange. It looked like nothing more than rock and shadow, but the song was already in the air. It floated soft as breath at first, then clearer, sweeter, impossible. Odysseus heard them. They called his name. They sang of knowledge, of secrets, of everything he had longed to know. They promised to show him the shape of the world, the fate of all men. He pulled against the ropes. He begged. He shouted. Tears streaked his face. not of fear, but of desire. But the crew could not hear. The ship passed by Dot, and as the music faded into the distance, so did the ache. Odysseus slumped against the mast, breath shaking. He had survived. But now he understood. Not all dangers come with teeth. Some come with beauty too sharp to hold. Scylla and Charybdis the waters narrowed. The ship moved into a stretch of sea where cliffs rose on either side like jagged teeth. The wind howled between the rocks, and the ocean below churned with restless energy. Odysseus knew what lay ahead. Circe had told him. On one side waited Scylla, a monster of many heads, hidden in the crags, waiting to snatch sailors as they passed. On the other, Charybdis, a whirlpool that drank the sea and spat it back, swallowing whole ships with no warning. There was no safe path, no perfect choice, only risk, only loss. Odysseus chose to steer closer to Scylla. He did not tell the crew what waited above. He did not let fear steal their strength. But inside, he prepared for grief. Better, he had been told, to lose 6 men than all. It did not feel like wisdom. It felt like sorrow waiting to bloom. They rowed fast and silent, eyes on the waves, hearts held tight. Then it happened. Without warning, Scylla struck. From above, her 6 necks lashed down like whips. Each mouth seized a man. They were lifted screaming into the air, their arms reaching, legs kicking, faces twisted in panic. Odysseus watched, helpless. He called their names. He swung his sword into air that held nothing. But Scylla had vanished, and the sea rolled on. No time to stop, no time to mourn. The ship passed through. The screams faded behind them, swallowed by the wind. The men sat still now, not out of strength, but because the pain had emptied them. They had made it through. But what was left behind was not just bodies. It was pieces of their hope. The forbidden scattle. The days grew longer. The food ran thin. The men's hands shook not from fear now, but from hunger. They drifted, searching for rest, for something more than fish and seawater. Then the island came into view, Thrinacia, golden grass, gentle slopes, herds of cattle moving slowly under the sun. Odysseus knew this place. Tiresias had spoken of it. Circe had warned of it. These were the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios, untouched, unblemished, eternal. To kill one was to break a law that no mortal could survive. He told his crew. He begged them. Do not touch the cattle, he said. No matter how empty your stomach, no matter how long we are here, eat only what we brought. The men agreed. They swore. They promised. But time is a slow poison. Storms pinned them on the island. The winds refused to blow. Days passed. Then weeks. The food ran out. The hunger became louder than memory, louder than reason. One night, while Odysseus slept, the men made their choice. They killed a few of the sacred cattle. They roasted them, prayed, and ate. The air changed. When Odysseus awoke and saw what had happened, he fell to his knees. He knew. He had seen the pattern before, defiance followed by loss, but it was too late now. The flesh had been eaten. The sun god had seen Dot, and in the heavens a storm began to form. Zeus strikes. They left the island as soon as the winds allowed. The ship cut through the water fast, as if trying to outrun a punishment. But the gods do not forget. The sun rose hot and harsh. The sky was a wall of blue, too perfect, too still. Then the clouds came, a flash, a roar, and the sea turned wild. Zeus, king of the gods, answered the sun's cry for justice. He sent a storm like none before. Lightning split the mast. Fire raced down the sail. The ship cracked. The oars flew from their sockets. Men were tossed into the sea like leaves in wind. One by one, they vanished beneath the waves. Odysseus clung to a broken beam, the last piece of a world undone. Around him, nothing remained but sky and water and the sound of thunder moving farther away. No ship, no crew, only silence. The sea held him, carried him. For 9 days he drifted, no food, no sail, only memory. He thought of every man he had led, every warning he had received, every choice he had made. The weight of it all pressed on his chest. But he did not let go. On the 10th day, the waves brought him to land. An island of shadows and songs, the home of the nymph Calypso. He was alive, but he was alone. The journey was not over, and the songs he had heard of home, of peace, of knowledge, still echoed in his mind. Chapter 30. The Island of the Timeless. The sea, always moving, always whispering, delivered him once more. Odysseus had been broken by storms, chased by gods, and battered by fate. Yet now he lay upon the pale sands of Ogygia, the island, outside of time. It was not his first time there, but the moment felt like a beginning. His body, half buried in sea foam, was motionless but not lifeless. His chest rose with shallow breath. His lips, salt-cracked and dry, whispered no words. And the waves, as if reluctant to let him go, lingered against his feet before receding. The island stood still under a silver sky. No birds cried, no wind moved the trees. Only the sound of water met the world, soft and slow like a lullaby. Ogygia was not a place of storms, it was a place of waiting. In this waiting, time seemed to forget itself. And yet, the man who had defied death more than once was not forgotten. The gods had preserved him, and the sea had finally brought him to the edge of stillness. Calypso's home lay hidden beyond a ridge of olive-covered hills. Flowers bloomed in impossible colors. Vines curled with fragrant sweetness. Even the air seemed softer here, heavy with perfume and memory. And as Odysseus rested on that shore, the island stirred with a silent knowing its guest had returned. But he had not come as a willing traveler. He had come as driftwood, flung upon the edge of the world. The gods had made their decisions. The storms had played their part. And now fate returned him to the one place where longing could be both healed and deepened. The island of Calypso. Calypso again in this chapter of the story, time folded back into itself like a ribbon in the breeze. We had once seen Calypso through the eyes of a weary man trapped and grieving. Now we see her again, but through the quiet reflection of memory. Odysseus had told his tale, and we had followed him across many lands. But the heart does not forget. The island of Ogygia. It lingers there, in the space between longing and release. Calypso was not like other women. She was a daughter of the Titans, older than most stories and untouched by age. Her eyes carried the color of the sea after a storm, wild and mournful. When she found Odysseus on the sand, she did not speak. She simply watched. In that still moment, her gaze held the weight of centuries. She knew the shape of sorrow. She had seen it in him before. She took him into her dwelling, carved into stone and overgrown with vines. a place where light filtered through leaves like liquid gold. She watched him gently, not as a lover, but as someone tending to a ghost returned. Days passed in slow silence. He healed, slowly, quietly. But Calypso's presence was like the sea. It could comfort, it could cradle, but it could never become a home. She offered him all that she had once again. Her love, her island, her eternity. She asked no questions about where he had been or what he had seen. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and even. "Stay," she said, as if the word itself could undo the ache in his heart. But Odysseus did not speak in return. His mind was already drifting westward toward Ithaca, toward Penelope, toward the boy who had become a man. The island, for all its beauty, was a cage made of flowers. And Calypso, for all her warmth, was still a keeper of time he could no longer afford to lose. In the stillness of that place, the ache of home became louder. Her kindness only made it more unbearable. The refusal of eternity. What does it mean to refuse paradise? To step away from safety, from beauty, from unending youth, just to embrace a world filled with pain and uncertainty? That was the choice Odysseus faced, and it was not an easy one. Calypso had promised him a life untouched by death. No storms, no aging, no sorrow. She would make him immortal. They could stay together forever. Just the two of them in a garden that never withered. But immortality came with a cost. It meant letting go of the past. Letting go of Ithaca. Letting go of everything he had fought for. Penelope, Telemachus, his kingdom, his people. All would vanish from his story like a dream he chose to forget. And Odysseus, though weary and worn, could not bear that the gods saw this. Athena, who had watched him from afar, sent a message to Zeus, and Zeus in turn sent Hermes down to Ogygia with a command. Calypso must let him go. She did not fight the order. But when she heard it, she wept. Not with anger, but with sorrow. Is it always the fate of goddesses to love mortal men who cannot stay? She whispered, more to the wind than to anyone else. Odysseus stood before her then, silent and torn. She gave him the choice: stay and live forever, or leave and face the sea again. He chose the sea, not because it was safer, but because it was real. He chose mortality. He chose his story with all its scars. And in doing so, he proved that love is not measured by what we keep, but by what we are willing to lose. As he turned his eyes toward the open water once more, Calypso stood behind him like a statue carved from grief. She had loved him, but she understood. Even eternity cannot compete with the call of home. A raft set free, she helped him build a raft. There was no bitterness in her hands, only quiet grace. Trees were felled gently, vines twisted into ropes, and wood shaped into a vessel. It was not grand, just enough to hold one man, his hope, and his longing. The raft seemed fragile, almost too small for the wide sea ahead. But in its humble frame was all the strength Odysseus needed, the strength to try again. The sun
rose slowly on the day he left. The water was still.
The island shimmered like a vision behind him. Calypso stood at the shore, her hair caught by the wind, her eyes watching him disappear inch by inch. She said nothing. There were no final words. Only the sound of the raft creaking and the waves stretching toward the horizon. Odysseus sailed alone. The wind guided him forward, but every ripple in the sea felt like a memory of days spent with Calypso, of dreams delayed, of promises waiting to be fulfilled. He did not look back. His eyes stayed forward on the unknown, on the distant coast he still hoped to reach. Gods had not promised an easy journey. There would be more trials, more tears, more danger, but Odysseus had made his choice. Not to rest, not to forget, but to remember, to finish what he had begun. As the island faded behind him, Ogygia returned to its quiet slumber. Time slowed again. The flowers bloomed, the trees whispered, and Calypso, eternal and alone, walked the paths of her island. With a heart that had known love and loss, the sea, ever patient, took back its traveler. The journey was not yet over, but in that moment, as the waves carried him onward, something in the world shifted. A man had chosen the hard road, not for glory, not for comfort, but for the simple, beautiful ache of home. Chapter 14. The Gentle Kingdom. The hull of Alcinous, king of the Phaeacians, had known many sounds, the rhythm of music, the voices of dancers, the laughter of feasts. But now it held only silence. Not an empty silence, but one that was full of story, of struggle, of reverence. Odysseus, the traveler from a far land, had finished speaking. His voice had carried the weight of years lost to wandering. His eyes, though calm, still held shadows of storms and memories too sharp to name. Yet in this moment he was still. Alcinous. And Queen Arete sat motionless on their thrones, not as rulers but as listeners, moved beyond words. The fire in the center of the room flickered low, casting soft gold light across the polished stone. Around them, the court remained quiet. No one dared break the hush that followed the end of the tale. For the man who had once been a stranger was no longer a mystery. He had become a mirror of endurance, a symbol of every soul who waits, who fights, who longs. The tale was more than a recounting of places and dangers. It was a journey through the heart of man, of loss, of will, of the slow pull of home. The hall did not echo with applause. It breathed softly, as though the building itself had listened. Even the sea beyond the palace seemed still, its waves gentle against the shore. For a moment, time rested. And in that rest, a man was no longer a wanderer. He was a survivor, a husband, a father, a king though far from his throne. The Phaeacians had opened their doors to a nameless man. Now they had heard the name that history would remember, Odysseus. Of Ithaca, gifts of honor. When the silence had softened into understanding, Alcinous stood and walked slowly toward his guest. His steps were not hurried, nor were they stiff with duty. They carried the weight of respect. With a voice both firm and gentle, the king called for the finest gifts, not out of formality, but as a gesture of true honor. Gold was brought first. Not coins, but shaped treasures, bowls, goblets, and finely worked ornaments that shimmered like captured sunlight. Then came bronze, weapons polished to gleam, engraved with stories of old battles and forgotten victories. Rich cloaks followed, woven in deep blues and reds, their threads touched with silver. Each item was chosen not to impress, but to reflect dignity, a tribute to the man who had suffered, endured, and still stood tall, but more than material. Wealth, the Phaeacians offered something greater, their trust, their admiration, their hearts. Servants came forward bearing sealed jars of oil and wine, food for the road, and wool blankets for warmth. The queen herself wrapped one around Odysseus's shoulders, a quiet act of care that needed no words. Children watched from the corners of the hall, their eyes wide with wonder. To them, he was more than a man. He was a legend in flesh, proof that stories were not just tales but truths carried by real hands, real hearts. Odysseus accepted each gift not with pride, but with humility. He bowed his head. His voice, when he spoke, was soft like wind over calm water. "You have given more than gold," he said. "You have given me your kindness." And in that exchange, the Phaeacians completed their part in the long journey of a weary soul. They had done what the gods themselves often failed to do. They had listened, believed, and given without asking in return. The last voyage, when morning came, the harbor was quiet. A great ship, unlike any seen in the world of men, rested in the water, sleek, strong, and made with the grace of divine craftsmanship. The Phaeacian ships were not guided by sail or oar, but by thought and purpose. They listened to the heart of the journey, and the sea obeyed. Odysseus stood at the water's edge, his feet pressed into the wet sand. Around him stood the king, the queen, and their people. No one rushed. No one hurried the goodbye. The sea breeze was soft, the sky open and pale. His heart ached with quiet hope. Could it be? Was Ithaca finally within reach? He boarded the ship slowly. There was no crew. The vessel needed none. It would carry him as if by magic, guided not by stars or winds, but by the simple truth of where he belonged. He lay upon soft rugs in the belly of the boat, and as the tide pulled it away from the shore, his eyes grew heavy. The ship moved without sound, without motion even, as if floating not across water, but through a dream, and he slept. For the first time in what felt like ages, he slept without fear. No monsters, no storms, no twisted games of gods. Just the soft cradle of peace. The Phaeacians watched until the ship vanished over the horizon, a silver speck swallowed by dawn. Then they turned back to their lives, content in the knowledge that they had helped turn a page in a great story. The sea, so often cruel, now held him gently. The gods, so often distant, now allowed him silence. And Odysseus, the man who had seen too much, drifted toward his home, asleep, at peace, and closer than ever. Ithaca's shore, the ship glided into a small cove beneath a low cliff. The morning was still young. Mist hugged the shore, soft and cool. Slowly the ship rested against the sand, its journey complete. Odysseus remained asleep, untouched by the landing, his chest rising in steady rhythm, his face calm. Two sailors, silent servants of the gods, lifted him gently from the ship and laid him on the beach among the scattered stones and whispering reeds. Then, without sound or farewell, the ship turned and vanished back into the sea, leaving no trace behind. Only the man remained. Odysseus awoke with the warmth of the sun on his face. He blinked, sat up, and looked around. The sand beneath him felt different, familiar in a way that struck deep in his chest. He touched it with his hands, slowly, as if unsure it was real. The wind carried the scent of olive trees. The hills in the distance wore the shapes he remembered from childhood. The cries of birds were not foreign, they were known. Known like a voice long missed, but he did not leap for joy. He did not cry out. Instead, he sat still, as if his heart needed time to believe what his eyes could see. Ithaca. After all the years, after all the loss, Ithaca had not vanished. It had waited, quietly, patiently, as if it too had endured its own form of longing. The beach was empty. No one rushed to greet him. No banners waved. No trumpets sounded. But in that silence, there was something more powerful than celebration. There was truth, the truth of return, the truth of land underfoot, the truth of a home still standing. Odysseus rose. He looked at the trees, the rocks, the sea behind him. He knew there was more to come. Challenges still waited. But this moment, this quiet morning on the edge of his island, was his, a gift from the gods. A pause in the storm, he knelt and pressed his hand into the earth. "Ithaca," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the breeze. And for the first time in a very long time, he smiled. Chapter 15. The King in Rags. The shores of Ithaca welcomed him with the soft breath of dawn. But to Odysseus, the land felt strange, not hostile, but unfamiliar, like a dream of a place once known. Mist clung low to the earth, wrapping the olive trees and winding paths in a quiet veil. He had longed for this moment. Yet now that it had come, it felt distant, delicate, unreal. The home of his heart was before him, but he could not walk it as himself, not yet. Athena came to him. As the mist deepened, she did not arrive with thunder or light. She stepped through the haze like morning itself, calm, steady, quiet. In her eyes was knowledge, in her hands, caution. She knew Ithaca was no longer the same, and neither was its king. The halls of his home had been taken by those who feasted freely, waiting for his wife's surrender. His name, once sacred, was now spoken in past tense. If at all doubt with a touch of her power, she changed him. His proud shoulders became bent, his hair thinned, his cloak frayed and stained. When she was done, no one would see a hero, only a beggar, tired and worn. This disguise would not shame him. It would shield him. A king must sometimes walk in shadow to reclaim the light, and so Odysseus moved inland, his feet quiet against the earth, his eyes open to every shape and sound. The trees whispered, the stones shifted, the birds watched. Everything felt both known and unknown, as if time itself had rearranged the island in his absence. But still, beneath the strange softness, the soul of Ithaca remained. It waited for its king and its reckoning. Eumaeus the swineherd, tucked away in the hills beyond the palace, was a small wooden hut, sturdy and plain. Smoke rose gently from its roof. Pigs shuffled lazily nearby. This was the home of Eumaeus, the swineherd, a servant of low station but of unshakable loyalty. Odysseus approached slowly, leaning on a stick, every step measured. In this form he would not be recognized, but perhaps he would be received. Eumaeus welcomed the stranger with warmth, not because of wealth or fame, but because of simple decency. He gave Odysseus a place by the fire, bread to eat, and a cloak for the chill. In his voice was sadness, not loud, but deep, the voice of a man who remembered better days and waited for their return. He spoke of the suitors who plagued the palace, of Penelope's sorrow, of the island's slow decay. Odysseus listened. He watched. In Eumaeus he saw something rare, a heart that had not hardened. Though the world around him had grown colder, this servant had remained kind. His loyalty had not been shaken by silence or time. He spoke of his master not as one lost, but as one hoped for. If Odysseus were to return, he said softly, he he would find at least one friend still waiting. The word struck something deep in the king's heart. In this humble home, he found more than shelter. He found a thread of the old world still intact. Eumaeus was no warrior, no nobleman, but he was an anchor, a quiet force that held the spirit of Ithaca in place. And as the fire crackled and night fell, Odysseus rested in a peace he had not known for years, not as a hero, not as a king, but as a man welcomed by one who loved him without needing to know him. A sun returns, days passed, slow and cautious. Then one morning, footsteps approached the hut. Eumaeus rose quickly and moved to the door. Outside stood Telemachus, grown, strong, eyes sharp with questions. He had been away, searching for news of a father he barely remembered, chasing stories across seas and cities. And now the sea had returned him to his own shore. Eumaeus greeted him with joy, tears hidden behind weathered smiles. He brought the young man inside, unaware of the moment that was about to unfold. Telemachus nodded politely to the beggar beside. The fire, not knowing he looked upon the face of the man he had searched for. Odysseus studied his son with silent awe. Here stood the boy he had last held as an infant, now a man, shaped by time and longing. Athena, watching from afar, came again in secret. With a sweep of her power, the disguise fell away. The rags melted, the age vanished. And for the first time in 20 years, father and son looked upon each other in truth. There were no loud cries, no outpouring of words. The silence between them held more than sound ever could. Telemachus stared, trembling, and Odysseus placed a hand on his shoulder. A nod, a breath, and in that moment, the years collapsed. They had been separated by war, gods, and fate. Now they were together, not just in blood, but in purpose. They spoke into the evening, low and careful. Telemachus told of the suitors, of their greed, their cruelty. Odysseus listened, a plan already forming behind his steady gaze. He did not speak of revenge. Not yet. But his silence carried its own promise. In the glow of the fire, they became more than family. They became a force, quiet and certain. The return of the king would not come with trumpets. It would come in shadows, with patience, with care. And it would begin not in the palace, but in this small, warm place, with two hearts once lost to each other, now found. Plans in shadow, they did not move at once. The kingdom was not yet ready, and neither were its people. The palace was full of watchful eyes and loose tongues. One wrong step and the hope of reunion could crumble into ruin. So they planned in silence. Odysseus remained in disguise, blending into the background of his own land. By day, he walked through the market, through the fields, unnoticed. He listened to the chatter of the townspeople. He watched the suitors from afar, saw their wasteful feasts, their cruel laughter, their false confidence. Each moment added another thread to the web he would one day pull tight. Telemachus, too, played his part. He returned to the palace with calm, hiding the fire that now burned in him. He smiled when expected, spoke with care, and learned who among the servants could be trusted. Not all in the palace had forgotten the true king. Some still whispered his name when no one was near. Eumaeus continued to serve as the quiet bridge between worlds, keeping the flow of news, offering shelter, and guarding the secret now shared by three. Their alliance was not loud, not boastful. It was the kind that grows steady in stillness, like roots deep in soil. The sun rose and fell. Days passed like the breath of wind through olive branches. And with each passing moment, the return of Odysseus became less a dream and more a truth taking shape. But for now, they waited. They watched. And in that waiting, there was strength. For not every victory is won in noise. Some are built in silence and patience, in the spaces where hope becomes action. And so, in the gentle hush of Ithaca's hills, a king in rags became a storm in stillness, waiting, watching, and ready. Chapter 16. Eyes That Remember. The palace of Ithaca was alive with noise, loud footsteps, careless laughter, the clinking of goblets and the scraping of heavy platters. The suitors feasted inside, unbothered by the quiet figure who stepped through the gates, disguised in rags, leaning on a crooked staff. Odysseus had returned to his home, but not as its king. Not yet. He walked among them like a shadow no one noticed, except for one dot in the dirt near the gate. Half covered in dust and time, lay an old dog. His name was Argos. Once he had been swift, proud, and strong, a hunter who had run beside his master in better days. But those days had long since faded. Left behind, ignored by the palace, Argos had aged in silence. His eyes were clouded, his legs stiff. His breath came slow and shallow, but when Odysseus passed, something stirred in the dying dog. His ears twitched. His nose caught a scent, faint but familiar. The scent of a man he had not seen in 20 years. The man he had never stopped waiting for. Argos tried to rise, but his legs failed him. Instead, his tail thumped once against the ground. Then again, Odysseus turned. His gaze met the dog's, and in that quiet, broken creature, he saw love that time could not erase. His heart clenched, but he did not speak. He could not. The suitors were too near. But his eyes said what his lips could not. Thank you. I remember you too. Argo Gigo. One final sigh. The effort had been his last, but it had been enough. He had waited long enough to see his master return. And then, gently, with no sound but the wind through the doorway, Argos died. The nurses. Touch inside the palace, the old ways were buried beneath new noise. Servants moved about with heavy trays. Laughter echoed in the halls. But one servant still walked the corridors with care, an old nurse named Euryclea. She had nursed Odysseus as a baby, watched him grow, and wept when he left for Troy. The years her back had bent, her hands had grown thin, but her heart remained sharp. That evening, she was told to wash the feet of the beggar who had arrived. A stranger, they said. Just a traveler passing through. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped the worn cloth around his leg. And then she saw it, a scar, long and curved, just above the knee. Her breath caught. Her hands froze. She had seen that scar before. Long ago, when a young boy had been gored by a boar during a hunt, she had dressed that wound herself. She had kissed it while he winced, promising him he'd be strong again. And now here it was, faded but clear. The truth struck her like thunder in silence. She looked up at him. Her eyes filled with tears. He met her gaze. A tiny shake of the head. Not yet. Don't speak. Not here. Euryclea bit back her cry. She pressed her hands to her chest and nodded. In that instant, she became more than a nurse again. She became a keeper of truth. Quietly, she finished the task, wrapped the leg again, and said nothing. But inside her, joy bloomed like fire. The boy she had loved was home, and she would protect his secret with her life. Penelope's test in the great hall. Penelope sat apart. From the noise, the suitors, loud and greedy, had grown bolder with each day. Yet she remained still, composed, but weary. Her eyes were shadowed with years of waiting, and her heart carried the weight of every passing season. She had woven her days into silence, unraveled her nights into patience. But even hope was thin when fed by absence. She had heard of the stranger, a beggar, they said, rough in appearance, quiet in manner. She asked to speak with him. Curiosity. They assumed. But for her, it was something deeper, a whisper in the soul that would not rest. Odysseus stood before her, hunched and cloaked, his voice low, his words careful. They spoke of many things, of travel, of Ithaca, of the suitors. But under each word was another, unspoken, trembling, reaching. Penelope listened closely. There was something in his tone, in the rhythm of his thoughts. She had not heard it in 20 years, and yet she could not be sure. Grief plays tricks on the ears. She asked him questions about her husband, his looks, his clothing. The beggar answered with care, giving details no stranger could know. She felt her heart stir, then retreat. Could it be? No, it was too much to risk. She had lived too long on the edge of almost. Still, something moved in her chest. That night, she lay awake. She stared at the ceiling. She remembered the touch of his hand, the sound of his laugh, the scar near his knee. She did not believe. Not yet, but she did hope. And that was enough to set her plan in motion. The bow and the axes. Penelope walked into the hall with slow grace. The suitors looked up, some smiling, others mocking. She said nothing to them. Her voice rose only when she called for Eumaeus. "Bring me my husband's bow," she said. The room quieted. Then she gave the command that would echo through the ages. She set the contest. 12 axe heads placed in a row. The bow, Odysseus's great bow, must be strung and a single arrow sent through all 12. "The man who does this," she said, "shall be my husband." The suitors laughed. They jostled. Each man tried and failed. The bow was too stiff, too strong. It would not yield to hands grown soft from ease. Then came the beggar. The room scoffed. But Penelope watched closely. Something inside her tightened, but she held her breath. Odysseus stepped forward. He held the bow like a memory, not a weapon. His fingers moved over the wood with the ease of long love. He bent it gently, steadily. The string hummed. Silence. Fell. He knocked an arrow, drew back, and let it fly. The arrow sang through the room, slicing air, slipping through all 12 axe heads in a line of perfect silence. It struck the post beyond with a soft thud. For a moment, no one breathed. And then, in that hush, something shifted in the world. Not loudly, not quickly, but like dawn rising after a night that had lasted far too long. Penelope stood still. Her heart beat louder than the gasps around her. She did not speak, not yet, but her eyes filled with tears. For the man who had strung the bow, the man in rags, was no longer a beggar. He was her husband, her king, her home. And the time for hiding was nearly done. Chapter 17. A storm in the hall. The hall of Vitha glowed with the last light of day, warm but heavy with expectation. The long wooden beams stretched above like the ribs of a ship, creaking softly as though holding their breath. The feast had ended, but the true contest had only just begun. At the far end of the room, the great bow of Odysseus lay untouched, silent as a memory waiting to awaken. It was no ordinary bow. Thick and unyielding, it had once sung in the hands of a king, a warrior who had bent storms to his will. Now it waited to be tested by those who claimed to deserve his place. The suitors gathered, laughing and loud at first. One by one, they approached the bow, confident in their strength. But the bow would not yield. Each man took it up with eager hands, boasting, straining, sweating, only to falter. Shoulders heaved, arms trembled, faces flushed with shame. They could not even string it, let alone send an arrow through the 12 narrow axe heads lined like ghostly sentinels across the floor. With each failure, the room grew quieter, and the weight of something ancient returned, the weight of truth. Drawing near Dot in the corner, still cloaked in dust and disguise, the beggar watched. No one looked twice at him now. He was part of the furniture, a shadow beneath the torchlight. But his eyes did not move from the bow. When all others had failed, he stepped forward, not with pride, but with patience. Gasps filled the room. Some jeered, others stared in disbelief. Telemachus, standing tall beside him, gave a small nod. Permission had been given. The beggar, the broken man in rags, was allowed to try. He walked toward the bow as if walking back into time itself. His hands touched the wood, and in that moment, something stirred in the air. A hush fell. Even the wind beyond the windows seemed to stop. The beggar lifted the bow with ease, as if it knew him still. His fingers found their place, slow and careful. Then, in a single breath, he strung it. No tremble, no strain. The silence grew louder than any shout. The arrow threw axes there. Were no words when the bow was strung, only wide eyes and hearts that beat too quickly. The beggar, now still and solemn, reached for the arrow, long and polished, its tip gleaming like a sliver of moonlight. He did not speak. He did not boast. He simply turned, aimed, and drew the bowstring back. The wood creaked softly, like an old door opening. The axes stood in a perfect line, their circles barely large enough for a swallow to pass through. Yet the arrow flew clean, faster than thought, straighter than fate. It slipped through all, 12 as though pulled by the gods themselves, and thudded into the wooden post at the end of the hall. For a moment there was no sound. The suitors stood frozen. Servants stared. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. Then came the change. In a voice no longer cracked with age, the beggar spoke, calm, but with a power that shattered the illusion. "You have long sat in the house of another man," he said. "You have devoured his food, courted his wife, and dishonored his home. But now the rightful king has returned." The beggar stood tall and threw off the cloak. His rags dropped to the floor. And there, before them all, stood Odysseus, no longer lost, no longer hidden. His eyes burned with memory. His chest was broad, his arms strong. The boy they had mocked, Telemachus, moved to his side with sword in hand. In that moment, time caught fire. The suitors scrambled. Chairs fell. Wine spilled. But it was too late. The door had been sealed. No one would leave that hall unchanged. Doors are sealed. The hall, once full of feasting and laughter, had become a trap. Telemachus had already moved swiftly to close the great doors. The heavy beams dropped into place, locking the exit like the final word of a sentence too long delayed. Outside, the world remained unaware. Inside, justice stirred. Odysseus stood like a storm waiting to break, no longer a beggar, no longer a shadow. His bow in hand, his stance sure, he looked upon the crowd not with rage, but with clarity. These were the men who had mocked his name, shamed his wife, and stolen years from his son. But he did not shout. He simply raised the bow again. The first arrow flew, and the first suitor fell. Antinous, the loudest of them all, dropped forward over the banquet table, eyes wide in disbelief. He had been laughing moments before, a goblet at his lips. Now silence took him. Panic rippled through the hall like fire racing across dry grass. Eurymachus leapt to his feet, stammering apologies, blaming Antinous, pleading for mercy. But Odysseus knew better. This was not about a single man. It was about all of them, the long decay of honor, the slow theft of peace. When Eurymachus charged, sword in hand, Odysseus answered with another arrow. And the hall grew red. Telemachus fought by his father's side, not with the recklessness of youth, but with the fire of purpose. They were not alone for long. Two loyal servants, Eumaeus and Philodius, joined them. They had waited, watched, and now acted with courage deep as the sea. The suitors, though many, were caught unprepared. Their swords were still sheathed. Their hearts were still full of wine. Against the rightful king, their strength scattered like ash. Vengeance is justice. What followed was swift, but not cruel. Each arrow flew with purpose. Each blow struck with memory. This was not vengeance born from fury, but from truth. Odysseus was not a man blinded by hate. He had waited years, suffered storms, and endured silence to return to this very moment. He fought not to destroy, but to restore. As the suitors fell, one by one, there was no joy in his eyes, only stillness. The firelight flickered across stone walls, painting shadows that danced like ghosts. Outside, the stars turned quietly. In the sky. Inside, the king reclaimed his home. When the last suitor fell, there was no cheer, only breath, slow and tired. Odysseus lowered his bow. Blood marked the floor, but so did peace. The great hall had been wounded, but in time it would heal. The pillars still stood. The home still held. Odysseus turned to Telemachus. Their eyes met, not as strangers, but as father and son, forged in battle, bonded in justice. Penelope, still unaware of the storm that had passed, waited in another room. But her world had already changed. The wheel had turned. The silence had ended. Odysseus did not speak. He simply walked toward the quiet where love waited, where truth would be tested not by arrows, but by time. The reckoning was done. The storm had passed. And in its place, a stillness more powerful than fury settled over the kingdom of Ithaca, like a breath held for years, finally released. Chapter 18. The Bed That Cannot Move. Night had settled gently over Ithaca. The winds had quieted, the torches dimmed, and the blood of the suitors had been washed from the floor. Yet within the heart of the palace, something far more delicate now stirred, a reunion long delayed, fragile as glass, held in the trembling hands of memory. Penelope had heard the news. Her suitors were gone. A stranger had risen among them, casting arrows with the strength of a storm. They said it was Odysseus, her husband, her king. But Penelope had learned not to trust hope too quickly. Time had taught her that faces can lie, and even voices can sound like dreams. Her heart beat heavily, but she wrapped herself in calm. Too many years had passed. Too many stories had proven false. She would not break now. She descended the stairs slowly, her steps as measured as her breath. In the hall, the stranger stood still. Older, yes, marked by hardship, salt, and sun. But in the line of his shoulders and the quiet strength in his gaze, there was something that pulled at her deeply. Still, she would not run to him. She had waited 20 years. If this was truly her husband, then one more moment could be endured. She ordered her servants to bring out the great bed, to move it from their chamber and prepare it for the guest. A test hidden in kindness, for no one could move that bed. It was not merely furniture. It was part of the house, carved from the olive tree that had once stood where their bedroom now lay. Only one man could know this truth. Only Odysseus. The man's reaction came swiftly. His brow furrowed and his voice rose, not in anger, but in disbelief. "What is this?" he asked. "Who moved my bed?" "That bed, I built it myself. Its frame rooted in the olive trunk. I shaped it with my own hands. No man could move it unless some god came and tore it from the earth." Penelope did not speak at once. Her eyes, long guarded, began to glisten. The truth had been revealed, not by proof, but by shared memory, something deeper than time. She stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. The stranger was no longer a stranger. The king was home, the bed of olive wood long before war had taken him away. Long before the world had grown so wide and cruel, Odysseus had planted a tree. In the courtyard of his home, an olive tree stood, strong, steady, unshaken by the sea winds. When the time came to build their marriage bed, he had made a choice not of comfort, but of meaning. He carved their bed from the trunk itself, leaving the roots in the ground. He shaped the posts and smoothed the wood with his own hands. The tree had not been destroyed, it had been transformed. Just as love must be, if it is to last, no one could move that bed because it was more than wood. It was a symbol of what? They had promised each other: permanence, patience, truth. In its stillness, it held their beginnings. And through all the years apart, Penelope had guarded it like a sacred flame. The moment Odysseus described it, she knew. No impostor could speak of that olive tree. No liar could know its roots still curled into the earth beneath their room. The truth was not in his face or voice, it was in the bed, in what it meant, and in what it had survived. Penelope wept, not from confusion, but from release. She had not dreamed him. He had returned. The bed they had once shared, the tree they had once honored, still stood. And now so did they. Two people shaped by sorrow, reaching toward one another again. In the quiet of that room, the olive bed waited, not as a relic of the past, but as the cradle of something eternal, a place where time bent, a place where what had been lost was now found. Tears for 20 years, the space between them vanished. Penelope moved with no more hesitation. Her arms wrapped around him as if to confirm what her mind now dared to believe. Odysseus, tired and trembling, held her just as tightly. They stood there, not speaking, because there were no words vast enough to carry what they felt. His face pressed into her shoulder. Her hands cradled the back of his head, and then the tears came. Heavy, honest, and long overdue. They did not sob loudly. Their cries were not desperate. Instead, they wept like rain falling after years of drought, quiet, cleansing, inevitable. Odysseus had crossed oceans, fought monsters, faced storms and temptations. But it was here, in this silent room, in the arms of his wife, that the weight finally lifted. The years had not been kind. The world had not been gentle. But in this embrace, none of that mattered. They were no longer separated by time. They were no longer characters in a tale of longing. They were simply man and woman, husband and wife, finding each other again. Penelope touched the lines of his face. He traced the curve of her cheek. They had both changed, but the change had not broken them. It had deepened them. For every moment they had been apart, there was now this moment to breathe, to feel, to heal. Dot around them, the palace stood still. The moon cast a gentle light through the high windows. Servants, knowing the sacredness of this reunion, kept their distance. Even the wind outside seemed to pause in reverence. 20 years, 20 winters of waiting, 20 springs of silence. All of it now melted into this one meeting where love did not need explanation, only presence. A kingdom-restored morning came slowly over Ithaca. The sky turned from deep blue to soft gold, as if even the heavens were careful not to wake the house too harshly. Inside the palace, all was calm. The hall, once echoing with the voices of suitors, now breathed in peace. Odysseus, risen with the sun, walked quietly through his home. It was smaller than the world he had seen, but more meaningful than all of it. Each stone, each beam, carried a story. And now at last he could be part of them again, not as a memory, but as a man. Penelope moved beside him. They did not speak much. They didn't need to. The house had begun to mend. The servants returned to their work with gentle smiles. Telemachus walked through the halls like a prince, not only by blood, but by bearing. The past had not been forgotten, but it had been redeemed. There was no parade, no great trumpet or feast. The restoration of Ithaca did not shout, it whispered. Fields were tended. Doors were opened. Songs returned to the hearth. Life, in its simplest form, began to bloom again. And at its center stood a king who had once been lost, and a queen who had never let go. The olive tree still stood in the courtyard, quiet and wise. Its roots reached down into the earth, holding firm. Its branches stretched toward the sky, catching light. And beneath it, a bed remained unmoved, the same as the day it was built, a testament to love that does not waver. Odysseus was home, not just in place, but in heart. The journey had ended not in thunder, but in stillness, in the quiet breath of a restored kingdom, in the gentle rustle of olive leaves, in the final chapter of a long and wondrous tale, closed not with an ending, but with peace.